Good afternoon.
Hi, Caitlin. How are you doing?
Hi, Sara. How are you?
Good, good.
Wonderful. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here. I have to say I was absolutely thrilled when we walked into this room and I saw this venue because I used to do a lot of theater, and this just takes me back, and I just feel like I'm on stage again. So we're going to enjoy this. Fabulous. So Sara and I took a little bit of a different approach to this conversation today because we've known each other for, a few years now. So we've worked together very closely in a lot of different capacities. But we wanted to take today to really be more responsive to what your guys' interests are. So if you don't mind, we're going to start with just a little bit of polling to kind of read the room. And we have not structured our conversation, so to speak, or prepared anything in a very strict way, because we really want to make sure that you guys are included in this conversation, that we're not starting in the middle. So just a couple of quick questions. Show of hands. How many of you work in an institution? Okay, I'd say that's a little less than half, maybe, somewhere in there.
Any kind of organization. Yeah.
Large institutions? Okay, and small institutions. Fantastic. Yes. And how many of you are independent, freelance, no institutional association? Good. Okay, so we've got a really nice mix. Fantastic. Now, how many of you would say that you are actively engaged in environmental work in your job? Meaning maybe you're part of a green team, maybe you're just doing really wonderful things in your own studio. That's good to see. Yeah. I like that. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. That's wonderful. So Sara and I wanted to, do you have any other questions for our audience?
No, so I'm just doing this because the lights are a killer. An absolute
we
killer.
Can see. I think I'm at a better angle for this. All right, fantastic. So we wanted to take a couple of steps back and start looking at the context of environmental responsibility and actually really looking at it within the wider picture of sustainability. And one of the things that I find can be nuanced, semantics, whatever you want to call it, is that a lot of times when people say sustainability or they talk about environmental responsibility, they use them interchangeably. But as we know, that's not really the case.
No, that's true. And I think it also puts people off because we're kind of looking at the investment principles generally. And environmental responsibility, we think, maybe people think you have to have a particular expertise in that space, but you don't, because I always say this. So I've worked in lots of different organisations, local authorities, universities. Now I'm in sport. How random is that? So I work for another investor, I work for another funder. But it's very much that everyone is an expert in their own space. They all know their own profession. It's just how you put that overlay on top. And I think that, say, in sport, sustainability has connotations of financial sustainability, and that turns people off. Here we've called it environmental responsibility, but also acknowledging that actually putting things in boxes, like with the principles generally, is difficult. And part of today was kind of showing the interconnections between, and actually environmental responsibility is absolutely tied to social responsibility and engagement. It's absolutely tied to climate justice. And it's that idea of kind of people thinking that environmental responsibility is just about measuring your carbon emissions, or it's just about reducing waste. And actually it's so much more than that, which is what I hope we're going to kind of explore a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is also something that's really interesting, and that, you know, when you're talking about sustainability and you're talking about these various issues, they're all interconnected. You really cannot talk about one without the other. You can't talk about, the burning of the Amazon without talking about indigenous rights, without talking about COVID, without talking about pollution, without talking about Black Lives Matter. The entire things, they all interweave together, which can be a little bit scary. And I do have to say, in my experience, one of the biggest barriers to environmental action, we'll call it, is that it's really overwhelming. And maybe we don't know where to begin. Maybe we don't feel we have the agency for it. But actually, at the end of the day, culture is a unique platform because we really have the power. We are the platform that can catalyze this paradigm shifting change that we need for a sustainable future. So I think what we wanted to kind of explore today was a little bit about the how, what does it mean to engage? How do we want to do this? And then also the opportunities. So what does this look like for culture to be leaders for environmental responsibility?
Absolutely, and regardless of scale as well. So I just wanted to chuck in now kind of my Amitav Ghosh quote, because I love it, from The Great Derangement or The Nutmeg's Curse. If you haven't read either, I'd recommend it. But he kind of talks about the climate crisis, and he was just saying it's asking us to imagine other forms of human existence. And again, for me, that speaks to that power of culture. If we can't imagine other ways of living, other ways of, existing in systems that are different to the ones that we have created. Because a lot of the time, pollution or crisis or climate crisis, whatever you want to call it, the biodiversity crisis, these are all kind of failures of our structures, our systems, and our decision making. So actually, how do we move outside of that? And I think that a huge kind of, it's so common that humans see themselves as outside of ecosystems. And I think it's really important for us to take that step back and remember that we are part of these natural cycles and these natural systems, and that we exist within. We've just layered on top these other kind of capitalist structures or other forms of decision making that have actually meant that the two are not in balance. There's no equilibrium, and actually, we can see what's happening as a result in terms of kind of the suffering and things that are going on.
Yeah, but I think that's so interesting because indeed what you're talking about with this idea of imagining what the future looks like. And so often, we see movies about the future and they're always kind of dystopian and it always looks really bleak. And of course, you combine that with what we see on the news every day and the impending crises and the continuous natural disasters that are happening more and more frequently, which we're kind of just normalizing, which scares me a little bit.
Absolutely.
But if we don't have a clear picture in mind, I always compare a sustainable future to doing a jigsaw puzzle upside down. So you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, right? And you have this beautiful picture that you're working towards, and you've been trained to match the pieces by color. That's how we do it, right? But if you flip it upside down and all of a sudden it's all brown, it's all the same color, and you don't know what the picture is because you don't have a picture, it seems absolutely impossible. But I always say that this is why we just need to put on our sustainability glasses, because it's about looking at things in a different way. And it's about not looking at one aspect, but the entire big picture. Because once again, sustainability runs, a golden thread through everything. So if you start and you think, okay, this is completely impossible, I can never do it, but let's at least give this a go. So we're going to start with the framework, which is, the edge pieces. We always start there anyway, right? And then if you start looking at the pieces in a little bit of a different light, instead of trying to pick them out by color, you start to look at things by shape. Before you know it, you can start picking out patterns and see how these two pieces fit and these two pieces fit. And before you know it, it's not so overwhelming. And I think that that's a little bit the power of culture, is that we can help paint those unknown pictures. We can come up with what is a desirable future, and we can convey that to our audiences in an incredibly powerful way that, science and climate scientists and the news just really can't do, because we connect with people on an emotional and personal level. And I love humans, but we're not really that rational.
This is very true. This is very true. And that's quite interesting. So where you're thinking about environmental responsibility in its broader sense, so using your power, your platform, regardless of what your practice is or if you're independent or working in a large organization. But then there's also that kind of like operational side of what could you be doing. So you've worked a lot with organizations across the world. And how do you find, where do people start with deciding that actually it's my practice and I'm going to use my power to influence all these people and kind of, show them a different future, or actually it's my organization that I can really work on first, and then these are the things that I'm going to do to make a difference?
Well, I think this is such an interesting question, because sometimes people think like you can do one without the other, but the reality is you need to be both. And this is really the old idiom, leading by example. It's very difficult to be a leader for sustainability if we're not practicing what we preach. So we do have to, we have this amazing opportunity to influence our audiences, our communities, the public at large, but we need to be looking at what we're doing and how we're doing what we're doing. And this is, of course, something that we're going to delve into a lot of detail about coming up apparently right now.
Yeah.
But I think I think that when it comes to looking at where we begin, it can be really overwhelming. And I did just want to very quickly sidestep and talk about something that I had mentioned to Willow earlier. And she said, don't tell me this now, remember it for the stage. So I'm remembering, which is we're talking about greenwashing, art washing, and green hushing. So a lot of institutions feel like they can't talk about the things that they're doing regarding sustainability because they don't want to be, greenwashing.
Critique, or they feel like what they're doing is not substantial enough.
So this is green hushing, because we all know greenwashing. It's this whole idea that you're basically false advertising that what you're doing is environmentally responsible. But then the bigger danger is green hushing, exactly what Sara was saying. If people don't feel that they're doing enough, or they feel like they're doing really well in one area but not in another, there's this fear of negative backlash that will impede people or deter people from wanting to talk about the good things that they're doing. And that can be even more dangerous, because if we're not learning from each other, if we're not sharing our practice with each other, if we're not publicizing to the world that we are doing this, then we're not making any progress.
Absolutely. And I think there is that there's a lot of duplication that happens also, because everybody is in their pockets doing great work or doing things, but actually we aren't learning from each other. And that's why I thought it was really interesting that I'm here as a sport person, used to work in a museum, used to work in a council, and I've been able to bounce around different sectors and just see the work that people have done, how things have progressed in different directions, but also that a lot of things aren't new. A lot of the concepts that we're talking about around environmental responsibility and sustainability, and now you have different terms of intersectionality and climate justice, new ways to articulate ideas. But actually, 20 years ago in local authorities, we were trying to do community retrofit schemes or whatever it might be, engagement or whatever. So I think there is also a lot to learn from. A lot of stuff already exists. We don't need to be worried that we need to make something new and tailor it very particularly to our practice or organisation, because about 80% of it is already there. And that's not being controversial, it's just being really honest, that actually the knowledge and the tools and the kind of expertise that we need already exists. It's actually, how do we get people to become agents of change? How do they how do we catalyze that action? How do we get everybody in this room to go home and think, right, I'm going to do something in the area of environmental responsibility, but I don't feel the pressure that I'm going to have to start this from scratch, because actually there's loads of stuff out there already.
Yeah, and I think that is indeed the issue. We don't have the time to reinvent the wheel, but as Sara already pointed out, the answers are already there. So it's just about implementing them. So maybe now we can switch over to individual agency and actually best practice. Now, you of course were the head of sustainability at the V&A. Maybe you could lay the groundwork a little bit for, your experience there, what kind of things you were working on, what was working, what wasn't working, staff engagement. And,
absolutely. So I think the important thing there, and I know that it's a large institution, which is very different to other organisations. So I say that, I share my experience knowing that. I'm also a trustee, a climate change trustee for the Museums Association. So work with organisations of all sizes. So have a nice kind of span of what different people are doing and how things are working. So I'll do a little bit of the large one and then a few other sizes. But it was really important to articulate why environmental responsibility was important to very much the mission of the museum. So V&A's art and design. So it's not like we're doing it because we think it's important to have a net zero target, or it's actually, how does this connect to our collections, what we do in terms of learning engagement, the power and platform and influence that we have, what bit of sustainability particularly connects to our mission. And then it was just really clearly articulating the sections, what are we going to do? Because otherwise you there's so much you could do and it's really confusing. Are we going to be focusing on biodiversity? Is it energy? Is it our public program? What are we doing? So it was very much looking at the areas of people, place, program, and then within each of those just deciding on some actions, but also acknowledging that we don't need to have a 10-year plan. It could be a 3-year plan. So what are we going to do first in the first 6 months, the first year, the next year? And if it doesn't work, we're kind of okay with that. We'll do something else. It was flexible enough to move. And that was really interesting because it brought together, a museum is very much like a village of professions. There's people working security, HR, finance, all the way to conservators and curators. And then how do you kind of appeal to all of those different people, but kind of show that they can get involved. And it was very much that kind of like crowdsourcing hive mind. As I said before, everyone knows what needs to be done. They maybe just don't have the time or that extra bit of expertise or the energy or the space to make it happen. And so it's really kind of unlocking that potential across the organisation. And there's those different examples of things that we did in those 2 years, and that happened before and after. But then also looking at other sizes of organisations, I feel ones that I've seen that have done some wonderful things are very connected to their communities. And again, the same thing of being connected to their mission of their organisation. But, you know, there's the Museum of Transport in Dundee or the Quaker Tapestry Museum in Kendal. They've done some great stuff using their collections to engage their communities in issues of extraction of natural resources or of flooding. And again, it's kind of picking what was really relevant to their organisation and to their community. And that's what was successful, because then once they've done a little bit of that, they're like, oh, now we can do something else. Oh, actually, now we're going to look at, can we, like, you know, retrofit our building to be more energy efficient. Now we're going to look at doing, you know, carbon literacy across like all of Scotland's museums or whatever it might be. And I think you get that kind of nice kind of rolling stone effect if you try something out. But again, it's very tailored. You don't feel like obliged to do it in a way that you've been told to do it, or because everyone has a net zero target, that's what we're going to do, because that doesn't work. It's not as meaningful as what you've made work in your organisation or your community.
So I think this is so important, and there's a couple of different elements I'd like to pick apart here. And I think one is this idea of motivation. And I was watching this TED Talk a couple weeks ago, and it was talking about kind of what motivates people today. And it was saying that in studies done by the London School of Economics in collaboration with it was a government agency in the United States. They were looking at, you know, financial drivers as motivators. And apparently that worked for jobs that were more, I don't want to say standardized, but it was jobs that, like in a factory, where it was kind of like you do this and then you do this and then you do this. And so it was like a very structured type of position where there was very clear instructions. But a lot of what we do today, and of course, being in a room full of creatives, jobs are no longer just, you know, put A and B and C. It's very much coming up with out of the box thinking. It's about coming up with new creative ways of approaching things. It's a lot more mind stretching, imagination implementation. And it was really interesting because the study was showing that if you increase the salary for job type A, that increased the output. But actually, job type B, the motivating factor was not financial. It was about the like personal reward you got for what you do. And I think that this is very much about sustainability as well. When you're approaching sustainability, as we mentioned, you know, it can feel overwhelming because there's so many different components to it, but in a way that is so exciting because it gives you the opportunity to connect with someone else about what matters to them. So maybe I'm really passionate about the climate, which I am, and maybe you're very passionate about community engagement, which she is. But instead of me coming to you and with my agenda and just saying, okay, you have to stop using plastic straws because it's ruining the turtles and you're a horrible person if you don't care about the turtles. I'm going to come to you and I'm going to meet you where you are and say, okay, it's be really interesting to see if we can combine these things. Maybe we can do like a community engagement program to educate, you know, elementary school children about the impacts of plastic on the sea. And so that's interesting to you. It's interesting for me. And it makes us both feel good because it reaches to our passions. But the other part you mentioned that I think is so important is this idea of the snowball effect. And I call it, you know, building on success. And a lot of times we are already doing things that are considered sustainable or that are environmentally responsible, but we're not pointing them out. And so we have a missed opportunity there for celebrating something great and for building the awareness that we are already acting. Because that's another big barrier I've noticed in my experience is that sometimes when you talk to people about environmental responsibility and they say they get defensive or they are not engaged, it's a lot of times simply because they find it overwhelming, or maybe they don't feel good about the fact that they're not doing enough. I talk to a lot of people who are, very conscientious about their travel, for example, and the impact, but they feel like they can't make any changes. So if you, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is absolutely a thing that happens in sport. Like, athletes travel for their job
Yeah.
and then find it really difficult to kind of use their platform to talk about other sustainability or environmental issues because they're worried. Whereas actually they could they could actually have like a huge influence still. And you could do things like think about systems change. So let's change competition calendars. Why are you flying people around the world? Actually, could you then influence all the international federations of your sport to make sure that all the competitions are held in one place rather than flying people between in the space of 1 year? So there's lots of like different ways of thinking about your influence and your impact, rather than feeling you have to be the perfect paragon of virtue if you're taking any kind of action in this space.
And that's actually another really interesting point, is that so many people expect, like, sustainability is black and white. It's either you're perfect at it or you're not doing anything. And sustainability is 100% a journey. It's taking steps, it's being transparent about what you're doing well, what you're not doing well. I travel a lot. I do everything within the European continent by train, but sometimes I have to fly. I'm going to Tunisia later this year, and I will have to fly there because actually the ferry across is even worse than the planes. So there's a whole thing. But it's just about being transparent about it and doing the best you can when you can. So making the choice to come here from Amsterdam by train rather than flying, and then also using that as a learning opportunity for people. But I think even the kind of circling back, looking at how you can not only celebrate your own successes, but also point out the successes of your colleagues. So, if someone brings a reusable water bottle to an event like this, you can point that out and say, oh, look how sustainable of you. And they might not even think that they're doing something sustainably.
But then eventually it becomes normal.
And then eventually it becomes normal.
That's where it gets to, where the habits become normal, where you don't have a particular commission or a particular exhibition that has a environmental kind of subject or topic, or what I see a lot is people put a lot of effort into making, if the subject is something environmental, then they'll think about the operation of that. Let's do an embodied carbon report, let's see where the materials are coming from, let's see the transport, all of that. But only for that one, not for all the work that they commission, or not for all of their practice. And where I'd like it to get to is that eventually, so we've done all the celebrating, we've highlighted this great stuff, we've got that kind of not the consensus, but we've got that motivation and that movement, but then it just becomes part of what you do, because actually environmental responsibility and sustainability is an enabler. And it shouldn't be seen as a separate, and we spoke this morning about boxes and things being put in boxes, and there's equity over here and this over there, and actually it all threads together and it does all kind of enable other things to happen. And that's kind of where we should get to with environmental responsibility. It's actually helping you to do your work in a better way, to reach the communities you want to kind of to deliver your creative vision. But it's not an add-on. Like I've always said, I would love it to be kind of, when people make financial decisions, so things are made on financial decisions. Do we have the money to do this thing? Actually, do we have the planetary resources to do this thing? So are we willing to take on the extra energy consumption of building that new wing? And then how does that balance against the community benefit building that extension will bring? And do we actually have those more nuanced conversations? Because people are able to hold many thoughts in their heads. And I think that's another thing about sustainability and responsibility. Everyone thinks that it's either this or that, like you said, black or white. And actually you can hold multiple concepts and ideas together and work them through. But do we think about the idea of planetary boundaries? And, do you think we could do less?
I was going to ask you the same question. So a couple of quick points before we jump into this hyper productivity and lack of resources, because I have so much to say about that. But you're talking about, sustainability being normalized, and that's so incredibly important, and not just environmental, but social, like the entire thing. I mean, we know that we have to have a major rehaul of our entire systems. So it is a little bit scary, but we will get there. I have total faith in us. But it's normalizing it, is not just about action, but it's also about conversation. And Vice President Al Gore always says the best thing you can do for the planet is talk about it. There was a study done by the Yale Climate Connection that they found that it was like 90% of adults in the United States don't talk about climate change, but it was something like 95% were worried about it. It was, I mean, don't quote me on those numbers because I don't have them in front of me, but it was really impressive that it was just something that people were kind of holding on to as a fear, but not discussing it. And if we can normalize it in conversations, that's already a really impressive first step. And maybe I'll just give a quick example of this because I always find it really helpful to, it's something called action-based storytelling, but you see it in action and then you can think like, oh, that's something I can do. So when I was a student studying art conservation, as was mentioned, I am a stone conservator by training. We would go to our tea breaks, and it used to drive me absolutely up a wall because we'd have, the coffee machine with hot water and everything, and then you'd have the glass mugs here, and then right next to them would be the paper cups. And we were not even leaving the hallway, and people would just pick up the paper cup and they would use it, and then they'd drink it, and then they'd throw it away. And I was just like, why are we not using the reusable ones? Why is everyone going for the disposable ones? So I tried a couple of different things, and it was really interesting to me because the first thing I tried was like hiding the paper cups, and then nobody was using them because they were not convenient and there. But then what was so interesting about this is it sparked a conversation. And before I know it, sustainability was like the topic of our tea breaks. And we would sit around and debate whether it was more environmentally responsible to use a paper cup that was lined with plastic that could be recycled. They can't be recycled, but that was a different discussion. Or whether we were using the glass cups, which then you had to wash, and the energy from the heating of the water, and then the surfactants from the detergent that you were using and contaminating the water. But it was so amazing to me that this was actually the topic of conversation now. And it got people thinking. And I really truly believe we all are really smart. And if we are armed with those critical thinking skills, if we start putting that into not only our daily context, but our daily practice, we'll come up with unbelievable solutions.
Absolutely. I always say when people are talking about sustainability or environmental issues, it's always be curious.
Yes.
Ask the question, be curious, and then be bold. Take the big steps. We don't actually have that much time to be fiddling around the edges.
No.
There's not that much time. So do the big things, and you'll be surprised at how many allies you find once you start having those conversations, once you start being curious and questioning why things are done the way that they're done. And then the other thing was just bringing in other people. So we mentioned before about meeting people where they are, but that power of bringing in partners, and collaboration is such an overused word, but it is really interesting that when you get people together who are like or not like, just the interest, because I do find in some sectors people are very much, we work with people who are from our sector and get what we do, whereas you can actually learn so much from other sectors or other types of organisations. And we are finding now that we're in a space where lots of people have aligned kind of objectives around environmental sustainability. So it's not like when I started working in the field 15 years ago, you'd be trying to get a space in an induction or talk to the finance director. It's now people are coming and asking, what are we doing on this and why are we not being more ambitious? So actually the doors are open. It's not like a thing you have to battle to talk about anymore, but you do have to kind of fight to make it meaningful and actually bring it into everything that you do, rather it being that kind of token, okay, we'll think about environmental responsibility for one of our projects or one of the things that we're working on, rather than all of the questions, because also there'll be different things for different, it doesn't have to be equal in the kind of the scale of what you do across all of your work. You might do one thing on one project, but loads on another, but it's different and it's tailored to where you have the most impact and where you have the most influence.
Yeah, and just picking up on your first point about asking the question, this is something that I tell people all the time. It is not your responsibility to be the expert on everything when it comes to sustainability. You do not have to know all of the answers. That is my job, that is Sara's job, that is all of your partners and your allies' job. This is something that we have to do together. But what you can do, what is your responsibility, what is your role, is to ask the questions. Go up to your director and say, what are we doing about environmental responsibility in our institution? Ask your curator, have you thought about doing an exhibition on climate control. I almost slipped there. I've been doing a lot with climate control lately, so if anyone's from a museum and wants to talk about climate control, please do come up and talk to me. But it's just about asking the right questions. And once again, you don't have to have the answers. And sometimes it does take a little bit of courage to ask a question that you don't know the answer to. But it's totally okay to do that, because this is how we find the solutions and find the solutions together. And this is how we find our partners. It's not about knowing, it's about asking. But I wanted to go back, because you were talking about asking the tough questions, and you brought this up a little bit earlier, and I would love to delve into the really, really tough question here, which is why we're doing what we're doing, what are we doing, how are we doing it, who are we doing it for, but most importantly, can we do less?
Yes, can we do less? So I'm kind of quite interested in this idea of planetary boundaries and this idea, do we have to keep doing so much? Can we do less? Can we do it better? Can we do it in a more considered way? This kind of hamster wheel we're on of constant production, whatever your sector or field is, I'm really intrigued by. And we had a slight conversation when we were talking in the museum sector of, do we need to do so many exhibitions? Could we do less? Could we do them using our objects from our existing collection? Are there different ways of still engaging our audiences and sparking creativity and doing all the things we want to do, but in a different way? I'd like to know your opinion on that.
I have a very strong opinion on that. So one of the biggest, I've talked a lot about barriers to sustainability, but it's always about lack, and that really upsets me in a lot of different ways. But most of the time when I'm talking with culture professionals, they say, I can't do this, or I can't do that. And then okay, well, why can't you do that? Well, usually it has to do with, I don't have enough time. I don't have the decision-making power. I'm just a conservator. But it's so frustrating to me that we're spending so much more time and energy producing so much more that we're actually just burning ourselves out. It's this idea of professionalism comes from production, comes from just mass consumption. I mean, it's why does a museum need to put on 12 exhibits a year? What is the value there? Is it, if you're trying to argue this from a single bottom line point, so just financial budget, are you really selling 12 times more tickets if you have 12 exhibitions? Or are you selling the same amount of tickets, you just have 12 times more production that you need to put into it? And I'm sorry, but I cannot fathom as a curator or as an artist how it must feel to put so much time and energy into something that you're so proud of and have it go up and show for 6 months and then have it literally be thrown in the trash can. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My comment is directly relating to can we do it less? And I thought that was a really good point. I'm keeping thinking about that. But the reality is, for independent artists who are project funded, not many people in this room are operating as project funded companies. And it's a system that they have to apply for project after project, and if they don't do the next project, they won't just automatically get paid. So that is maybe one of many reasons why some people can't do less.
Oh. And I think it's really interesting to untangle those systems that are putting us in this position and putting people in that position.
Yeah, this is, I thank you so much for bringing that up, because that's actually really the foundation about why we're in this constant circular hyper-productivity stress, because we're stressed about our jobs, because guess what? The cultural sector is financially unsustainable. So it's very difficult to be it's very difficult to be environmentally sustainable or socially sustainable if you're not financially sustainable. And I cannot tell you, I have so many problems with the way that we are reliant on funding streams that tend to be, what's the word I'm looking for? This short-term thinking. It's if you're really pressured from project to project, if you're reliant on your next grant or your next funding, then of course you're going to be overwhelmed and you have to be hyper productive because you're only getting X amount of money for X amount of months. And so then you're already constantly thinking about the next thing. And it's really, really challenging to be able to break out of that cycle. And I think that ultimately, it's maybe not even a question about hyperproductivity and can we do less. It's about can we do more with what we have. And actually, what you're talking about with environmental boundaries, it's also about social boundaries, and it's about our own well-being. And I think that we need a really massive redistribution of our resources, because the truth of the matter is that we do have enough on this planet to sustain life. The problem is that the way that we're consuming, the way that we're using is very, very wasteful. And that goes from, what is the percentage of food waste every year in the UK? I know it for other countries, but it's pretty intense. To the way that we are budgeting our institutions, or even the way that we function as independent curators, conservators, workers. The system's basically designed to be reliant on this hyperproduction, or more is better. Whereas actually, if we reimagine it, and once again, this is where culture comes into play, because what would it look like? We don't know.
Huge questions, we don't know. But I did want to ask you actually, because you had mentioned a few times about kind of working in different countries and the kind of global perspective.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. So we had, like, in the breakout tables earlier, we were talking about Arts Council England and what are we doing in England. And I spoke before about how, we do need to take ideas from other places and examples and understand that we're all kind of interconnected. So do you have, like, kind of what are your examples of interesting things you've seen in other countries? Because it's all kind of, again, that entanglement of, climate and colonialism and resource extraction and, who has power. All these things are all connected. But in terms of the practical things that different creative and cultural organisations are doing in other places that you could bring here.
Where do you want me to start? I have so many.
Sorry, that's really big.
Big questions. I'm still a little bit thinking about this hyper-productivity thing. And I think that really, for me, what's really interesting is exploring the idea of what is a sustainable museum. And the best examples that I've seen are primarily in Africa. And we work very closely with the National Museum of Lagos in Nigeria, as well as several museums in Mozambique and in Kenya and other parts of the continent. And I have been so inspired by the way that African museums have really been able to tap into their local communities, and they're much more community facing than a lot of institutions I find in not the global north, but in Europe and in North America. And I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. But it just goes kind of back to, like, reassessing what our values are, and what the purpose is, what our mission is, what we're trying to fulfill. And one of the conversations I had with a colleague a couple days ago, and I will not mention the museum that this colleague works at, but we were talking about once again, I'm going back to the distribution of resources, and I was talking about this issue of climate control. And as we know in museums, climate control is one of the most carbon intensive and the most energy intensive systems. And it's really, really not necessary. And once again, I am a conservator. Please come talk to me if you want to get into the whole thing, but we don't have time for that right now. But what we do have time for is to look at, okay, so why are we doing this? And then how do we make change? And so many people say, well, we can't make change because of loan agreements. And so if we don't, adhere to X museum standards of loan agreements, then, we can't borrow objects from them. And then, we're going to be losing our credibility, or we're going to be losing our prestige, and we can't, draw people in, and so we're going to go bankrupt, and it's going to be disastrous. But what was interesting to me is I was having lunch with a woman who works at one of the more prominent museums, and she was saying, well, actually, and there was an article that came out in the New York Times about a month ago that talks about this issue, and it gives the Guggenheim Bilbao as an example. And what the Guggenheim Bilbao did is they changed their climate control conditions. But then that means, of course, that they have to call all of the other organizations that they have loan agreements with for the next however many years and say, listen, we've changed our climate control conditions. This is the updated clause in the loan agreement. Are you guys cool with that? And everyone came back, except for one, saying, that's totally fine, no problem. And then the one that came back said, let us talk about it and we'll get back to you. So there were no flat out no's, which I think is really inspiring. But what was so interesting about this conversation with my colleague was that she was saying, yeah, that's fine and all, but do you know how much time it takes to call all of those people? And I thought, okay, well then, you're saving so much money from your energy bill because you can save between 24 and 82% of your energy bill by changing your climate control conditions. I mean, and with the energy crisis right now, that seems like such a no-brainer. And I'm like, well, just take the money that you have from your energy bill and put it into hiring another staff member. And then you have a person dedicated just to do that. And no, well, we can't do that because we have, expenses and we have staff, and those are very set. And, so consequently, we cannot take money from here and put it over here. I get tired of hearing I can't. Well, then we're going back, and I said, well, okay, well, maybe what we can do is, so my company, Key Culture, we basically, our entire existence is to help people make sustainability accessible and easy. So this is what we do. So I'm always about trying to find solutions. So I said, okay, cool. Well, maybe you guys can hire us, and then you can put it in the expense part of things, but then one of our staff members can actually do that so that you can still, and so she was like, that's a great idea. And I was like, okay, I'm glad we came up with a solution. But it's amazing to me that we have these stringent
also
lines.
That's also an example of untangling a thing, and that thing of being curious. So and that's on a major scale for giant museums, but there's loads of other other examples in all kinds of sectors where you just pull at the thread and you'll be like, but why? And someone will be like, oh, because of X, Y, Z, but why? And then you bring in your partners or you bring in somebody else to, as you said, find those solutions. And I think that's why they're trying to bring into definitely kind of education here in schools, for example, the idea of critical thinking and curiosity are actual kind of environmental skills, because that's what you've got to do. You've got to kind of untangle it and then be quite tenacious. You have to be quite persistent to kind of follow all those leads and then kind of be like, but why? And now this is what we're going to do. But then, as you said, you have that example that others can then pick up from. And because it's interconnected and everyone looks at everyone else, and it's got to be easy as well. So if you do find a way to make it easy, people are more likely to get involved, because there's a spectrum of, I can't remember what it's called, but the people that are really passionate about environmental issues, the people that really don't want to hear about it, but then there's this mass in between who are really quite ambivalent. They don't really care either way. So they're the people to work on to persuade, because they're the ones that, if I'm talking about, say, spectators at sports games, or consumers of culture, or people that attend events or participate in things, they're the mass that can be swayed. Yeah. And that's where you have that power and influence to sway those people.
So I this is exactly what I like to tell people, the why, and just keep asking why. Why are we doing what we're doing, and pulling it back. So I have a thought, and this is going back to the question about hyperproductivity. We also have to really think very seriously about where our biggest impact is. So as a large-scale institution that is producing 12 exhibits a year unnecessarily, and maybe some of those go in the trash, maybe some of them don't, this is maybe the scale where scaling back can be really impactful, and also making a statement about it. But maybe if you're an independent curator, if you're an independent artist, then it's not about scaling back, it's about using your outputs to be educating and connecting people with the issues. So I really think, and I think that this is something really important for us all to take into consideration, is where can we have the biggest influence? And this is one of the issues that actually when I started this whole nexus of sustainability and culture, I would talk to people at museums that would say, yeah, but we're such a small piece of the pie that it doesn't matter. And so, but that's no longer an excuse, especially as we learn more about the actual environmental impact of museums. But I'm thinking a little bit more okay, because we work, of course, my organization, we work with large institutions and organizations, but we also work with a lot of independent professionals. And so it is that question of as an individual, what is your biggest impact? And, I think that it's really important for, once again, going back to this idea of sustainability not being black and white, and it being a journey. And maybe it is a situation where you can't change the number of artist commissions that you're getting, and you don't want to because that's your income, and that's great. And but maybe what we're looking at is the materials that you're using. Maybe we can start thinking about end of life cycle. So what's actually happening to the stuff that you're making after it's done with its exhibition or after it's done. Maybe we're thinking about how it's being toured. So we can look at, more environmentally responsible shipping. Maybe we can just start thinking about how we use our voice as an artist or as a curator to talk about issues that are important to us in our communities. So once again, it's not about, completely and totally saying that what we're doing is bad, because it's not. And this is actually what was really interesting for me and one of my forays into sustainability, because as an art conservator, I knew that what I was doing was a wonderful thing. I became an art conservator because I was fortunate enough to have the experience of going to different museums when I was a little girl and seeing these magnificent artworks that really connected with me. And I wanted to preserve that experience for another little girl down, in 100 years, to have that same profound, emotional, wow moment. But the way that I was doing it was really negatively impactful in so many ways. Conservation is not only responsible for the whole climate control and energy consumption conversation, but we use a lot of toxic chemicals. We produce a lot of waste. We are just obsessed with plastics. And actually, can we do what we want to do, but not in a harmful way? And it was really interesting for me because, sustainability in its current definition is something that meets the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. And there are, of course, different definitions, different contexts. We know it means different things to different people. But for me, it was my friend Henry McGee who said that sustainability is doing good without doing harm. And I just completely resonated with that. And I was like, that is why I have a problem with my day job, because I know what I'm doing is a good thing, but the way I'm doing it is harmful.
I think that's so interesting. It's that idea of a lot of time people think about environmental responsibility as reducing negative impacts, but actually what is the net positive impact? So again, you're finding this is like a positive, it's a positive thing that we want to do. And so I always find that when I talk about environmental responsibility, not always talking about we will reduce our negative impact, because actually there's so much net positive stuff you could be doing. And are we focusing on that and remembering that side of things? Because that actually, if you talk in terms of hope, that resonates with people more, as we all know, than the doom and gloom of we're all going to burn or whatever it might be, that you get in a lot of scientific or kind of mainstream media. But actually, if it's talking more in a kind of a hopeful solutions type manner, that makes a big difference. I'll be in time for questions. So I don't know if that brings us on to space for questions, unless you wanted to.
I have one very
very
last thought, and then we can open up. So we're talking a lot about sustainability today, and a lot of people in the sustainability circle that I run in don't really like that word. And what I think is really interesting, and this is something that I feel is expressly applicable to the cultural sector, is actually the idea of regeneration. So we can think about our output in terms of not only taking stuff and putting things out, but what is the contribution? What do we get? What does society get back from it?
Yeah,
exactly.
That's quite an ecological concept too.
Very much.
And I think it is. This is always same thing. Whenever all us sustainability managers get together, we're like, we hate our job titles. Should it be this? Should it be that? But then I think the biggest thing to take away is just to get on and do something. Yeah. So take action and do something. Just start from somewhere, regardless of what you call it or what box it goes in or what box a funder or an organisation puts it in. It's just get on and do something. So make a start.
100%. Questions?
Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys. Oh God, hello. Thanks so much, everyone. You guys, sorry. I really resonated with what you guys are saying about overwhelm being a massive barrier to action, and also us thinking about environmental responsibility as quite individualized rather than a collective effort. But I did think, and also what you were saying about 80% of the resources already exists, that's already been done. But I actually think a barrier working in small arts organizations has really been, there is so many resources out there, that's so overwhelming in itself, it's contributing to the overwhelm. So I wonder if you have advice for kind of smaller arts organizations, freelancers, for navigating that space and finding what's relevant to them.
So interesting. This is something I say at work all the time. We have too many resources. Let's not create more resources. I think almost you need somebody I would say. So if you're part of a network or a collective or an association or an organisation that almost does that curation for you. So just as an example, like for the sports that we fund, I will say, look, these are the top 3 things. So read this, fill out this, and start with this. And that takes away some of the overwhelm. So you've had somebody who's done that curation piece for you. I mean, I know you have a really diversity of sector in terms of size of organisation and type of practice, but I think, and I don't know who the person would be to do this for all the freelancers or all the individual artists, but I think the role of organisations, maybe it's an arts council thing, I don't know, but it is to do that curation and go through like Julie's bicycles, massive set of resources. There's just so much, but actually here are the top 3 things that you can start with. And then if you want to come back for more, you can. So it feels like there must be some umbrella organisations or the funders or whoever it is, it's their responsibility to respond to the need of particular types of audiences. So I will deal with, my smaller sports with 3 members of staff differently to the bigger sports that have 50 to 100 members of staff. And that's my responsibility as a funder to do that. So I think that there are umbrella organisations or other networks that can do that curation piece and cut through that overwhelm with resource fatigue.
Thank you. We've got a question further up.
Oh, yeah. So first of all, thank you for giving that talk. And completely forgot what my question was now. Oh, yeah. So you gave the example of some of the museums and galleries that exist in Africa and what they're doing to reduce their carbon footprint. Is there anything else other than just sort of like getting rid of paper cups and sort of like smaller things, but bigger things that organizations can do to really be climate conscious and build it into their CSR report when they're looking at programs and things that they're doing? Is there things that they can sort of envision what they'd like to do in the future in terms of being more climate focused and having an awareness of the environment, which obviously organizations should do anyway, but how do you build it into an organization's culture so that it trickles down with everyone present on how they can be more climate focused?
I can start with a little bit and then you can continue. So you had some top tips that you wanted to share anyway, but I think literacy is a massive thing. So sustainability or carbon literacy is massive. So carbon literacy is kind of based on climate, and obviously there's lots of other issues, which is why I said sustainability as well, but it's kind of giving yourself that base level of kind of knowledge and confidence to talk about climate and ask the right questions. And that's like an externally certified qualification. So we did this a lot at the V&A, we're doing it in the sports sector now. And you have kind of focused toolkits depending on your sector. So I know there's like an arts museums one as well, but it's everyone becoming literate. And that really helps because it doesn't matter where you are in an organisation or if you're by yourself or where you work, you can ask your partners and the people that you work with and other departments the right questions. So I think the literacy thing is an absolutely massive piece. And then things that we did at the V&A were around kind of catering to what people wanted. So if they wanted to know more about procurement or if they wanted to know more about biodiversity, we put on those training sessions for them. So again, they could just feel a bit more confident and knowledgeable and have a space to ask the questions they don't feel they can ask anywhere else. That really helped. And I think my last thing was really around finance and investments. So in terms of making impact, anything from pensions to any kind of investment, that's where you can make a massive impact when it comes to climate and actually thinking about where those funds are kind of put.
Yeah, I would agree with Sara in terms of education is key. I think especially when it comes to creating cultures of sustainability within organizations, everyone needs to feel part of it. It is not effective if you just go to someone and just say, okay, you now have to do it this way because we have this senior level policy and it's changing your job and you have no say in it. It's much, much easier to invite people to be part of the conversation, give them a sense of ownership, make sure that they're a part of it, because then once again, motivation factor, we've learned it's much more impactful to be able to have people be proud of what they're doing rather than just going through the motions. So I think education is hugely key. As I mentioned before, we if we have the critical thinking skills, then we'll be able to actually implement them. I don't think there's anyone I've ever met in the cultural sector who says, I don't care about the planet and I'm just here, because I want to, and I'm not interested in doing anything differently if that has a better impact. So it's really easy for us to be able to empower people by giving them the tools and resources. We were talking about resource overload, but we'll just call it the knowledge to be able to make the right decisions. And I think the first part of your question, rather, in terms of what institutions can do, it does depend on the institution and you have to kind of see what their impact is. But everything from looking at your climate control to looking at your procurement strategy, that's a huge one. Also, your accessibility aspects in terms of where your visitors are coming from, how they're getting there. Is it, is your institution accessible by public transport? There's a lot of different entry levels. So it's always a lot of the time it's really helpful to start with like a carbon audit. And I have to be very wary of this because I'm obviously very much pro doing carbon calculations, but I don't want you to spend too much time there because that's actually a means to an end. It's just a tool. It's not the end result. I think that's very dangerous because a lot of institutions spend so much time and money measuring every little detail, and then they go, look at our beautiful carbon report. And it's like, cool. What are we going to do with that? So it's actually like it should be, here's our carbon, here's our baseline. Now, here are the things that we have the opportunity to improve on. And look how fabulous we're doing now. Look at the before and after. It's not about the before being the end point. So start with a carbon calculation, but a simple one.
Can I just, on that, because I think that question was a grounding one in a sense, and perhaps I can ask you guys if you could answer succinctly. Have you experienced taking a difficult, resistant organization towards being environmentally responsible? And what did you do to turn them round?
Absolutely. I wouldn't say it's organisations necessarily. Okay. I would say departments almost. I worked at the University of East London many years ago. Awesome, crazy place. And universities are, especially ones in East London. But there was departments that were very much, there was the maintenance departments who were very much, no, we don't do that because A, we don't know how to, and that's too much work, and we're not going to. And it was just something really basic, like LED lighting. This was like back in the day, so things have moved on from that. But it was just something really simple. And it was what Caitlin said, it was making people feel it was part of their idea is actually what then made them advocates, because then after doing that initial project, they were then coming to me with other ideas and other projects they could do. This other great energy efficiency stuff, and actually, why aren't we doing more? And we could do this, and we could ask for money for this. And so again, it was that making them feel like it was part of their idea, making it easy, so I'll do all your business bids for you. But then it was that success. They'd had a success, and it made them feel good, and it was actually a better outcome in terms of maintaining said lights because they went up and down ladders so much. And, it was all those kind of co-benefits then made them just really get involved. And that was like a micro example of a department within an organisation, but I think the principles follow.
Yes, I've had a lot of experience working with trying to get over hurdles. And I would say, I would agree with Sara in terms of it's about creating that ownership. And it's also just about meeting people where they are, especially in terms of like figuring out what their agenda is. And I do a lot of training and work with people in terms of like sustainability communication and how to talk about sustainability with your colleagues, your peers, but also your upper management. And so many times I get people who come to me and say like, I had this great idea for this project, but upper management won't buy in. And then I say, well, what is upper management's agenda right now? Are they focused on the financial bottom line, in which case you need to make basically a business case for this or talk about how it's going to save money? By the way, this is something I wanted to mention earlier. You said succinct. I'll stop talking after this. Sustainability is always, always, always more financially interesting. It may be that it takes a little bit of time, like upfront investment, but it will pay off in the end, especially when it comes to how much money are we spending on disaster relief. So always that is a good argument, but it is about finding out what people's agenda is and and how you can align it. So seeing like, okay, if you're interested in the financial aspect, I'm going to come at this with you as like a business case. Or if you're interested in upping our numbers of visitors, I'm going to come at you with this project, but I'm going to say that, it's going to increase our traffic. So it's about finding where people's interests are and then aligning your agenda to their agenda.
Thank you. Another question, and then we have a question also on this side, a few rows down.
Yeah. Hi, I'm going to hopefully not take too much time, but I've got two questions, if I may. One is around, we did a carbon footprint measurement, and actually we're a small organisation. We don't do lots of kind of shipping. We don't have any climate control. And our biggest carbon footprint is actually our audience's travel. And as like kind of post-COVID, when we did the kind of level, our figures were quite low and they're getting bigger, and therefore the impact on carbon is actually increasing as our audience figures kind of grow back up. So that's, if you have any ideas about how to kind of deal with audience figures. And then the second one was just, we're hoping to get some expertise in our trustee board around environmentalism and environmental sustainability. And we just haven't found anyone really that's kind of coming forward. So any ideas about where to find kind of trustees that would be really helpful on a board?
Go with trustees. If
Right,
you want to start with
I don't live in the UK, so I'll answer one and you answer two.
That works. That totally works. And I find this a lot actually because I get asked to be a trustee of a lot of places because you're a bit of a unicorn working in sustainability, but also not being white. And I always check. I'm like, is it because I'm increasing the diversity of your board, or you want my expertise people? Just going to put that out there. But I think the way to ask is a lot of people don't know that they could be a trustee, and I think it's. I used to work in engineering, and there's loads of awesome sustainability people who work in loads of engineering consultancies like around the country. And I think it's almost, there isn't like a broker space, but it's almost advertising in spaces that maybe you wouldn't think to try and get those sustainability professionals. So there are like organisations like IEMA, which is the Institute of Environmental Management Professionals, advertising those kind of spaces. But sorry, I wanted to give a more practical response than that. But yeah, there's IEMA, which is a good place to kind of advertise. But just getting it out, like a lot of word of mouth and finding people on LinkedIn that have kind of sustainability. There's lots of networks. There's like, there's a network of sustainability professionals in higher education. That's like a whole pool of trustees. There's loads of sustainability people in that network. There's the same network for local authorities. There's like, all these people do exist. I guess it's just how you maybe cleverly use your social media or use IEMA or do some direct approaches. That's another thing that can work. I know people that just do general like sustainability searches and then just ask, because a lot of people I know definitely doing trustee stuff in different places over a different number of years don't think that they can do that role. They see it as a really big inaccessible thing or something they don't have time for or expertise for. So it's almost like that two-way thing of you want their environmental expertise, but you also want them to feel that they're capable of contributing and kind of laying out how and why they could. So I think, contact like the professional networks like IEMA, but then just use social media and find people with sustainability or environment in their job title. And if they're interested, just ask.
And I will answer your first question, and that's a great question and a very difficult one. A lot of cultural institutions, their biggest carbon footprint is their audience, because of course you can't control where people are coming from or how they got there. And you don't want to say, I'm sorry, you can't come unless you came by train. Although I did have a museum once tell me they were going to do that, but then of course that's like not accessible. So anyway, that doesn't work, right? So how do we make sure that our doors are open to everyone who wants to come and we are being accessible and inclusive? And I could get into a whole discussion about inclusivity versus belonging, but we don't have time for that. But also, of course, look at your carbon footprint. And I think that there's basically two things that you need to do here. Well, maybe three. One is transparency. A lot of people don't really think about their carbon footprint of their mobility or their travel. So this is a great learning opportunity. And you can, have something in your entryway that talks about, did you get here by foot, then it's 0 carbon footprint. Did you get here by bike? Then it's this. Did you get here by car? Then it's this. Did you get here by bus or train? Did you get here by plane? So it's an educational moment for your visitors. And then, of course, the next step of this would be trying to curb that. So you could provide, for example, incentives for people who come by bike or public transport. You can also make sure that you are accessible by public transport. I know that can be difficult sometimes, but there's definitely at least lobbying that you could do if there's changing a bus route, for example. And then, of course, this brings up the whole conversation of, and I'm using air quotes here, offsetting. Basically, right now, how a lot of organizations cope with these issues that they don't really have control over, it's usually called Scope 3, is by offsetting their carbon emissions, which basically means taking a bunch of money and putting it into a program that will offset or balance out the carbon. And how this tends to work is that you say, like, okay, I'm going to put it into this program, which is going to plant trees in Indonesia, and voila, we're good. There are so many problems with offsetting. I'm not going to get into those because that's a whole nother conversation, and I want to hear your guys' questions. If you want to learn more about it, John Oliver did a really fabulous expose on carbon offsetting. So just find the YouTube video. It's like 23 minutes, really excellent, and also a great educational tool for people who don't know about it. So share it with your friends. But basically, the short-term solution for this is there are things called strategic climate funds. And those are more or less pre-vetted funds that have immediate impact within the 7-year framework that we have to tackle and curb this issue. Because one of the big problems we have with carbon offsetting is that, if you plant a tree, then it takes 10 years for the tree to actually sequester the carbon that you emitted in the first place. And by that time, that tree is probably already cut down. So it doesn't work. But there are projects and programs that are absolutely amazing that have immediate impacts. My personal favorite is one called Art to Acres. It's an organization, they're based in the United States, but they take money and buy at-risk land in primarily South America and Central America. So if there's land that has been earmarked for being turned into agricultural farmland, which we know is one of the biggest carbon issues, or actually greenhouse gas issues in the world, they will buy it up and then donate it to indigenous people or to governments. So it's actually a way to have a huge, huge impact immediately. The Gallery Climate Coalition has a whole list of strategic climate funds, as well as some information around communicating about them. And once again, this is a great opportunity to build awareness with your audiences by showcasing what you're doing and teaching them about strategic climate funds, as well as how you guys are grappling with grappling with your carbon footprint.
Another question, please. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Rowan from Wild Rumpus. Our work is all around nature connectedness, so I'm aware that I might be living in a bit of an echo chamber when it comes to this conversation. But I guess my question is about how we balance as a sector the fact that lots of people, lots of organisations in this room and the wider sector are really deep in this work and are kind of leading the way and are best practice, alongside organisations who are earlier in their journey. There's been a lot of talk today about kind of starting points, barriers to start, and it feels like we're way past starting, so it feels a little bit like how can we have this conversation in an inclusive way whilst honouring the real quality, deep work that's happening?
I think communication is key. I think one of the biggest problems we have in the sector is that there is so much amazing work going on there and people don't know about it. I firmly believe that the best chance we have at succeeding in this transformation to a sustainable future is by working together and by peer-to-peer knowledge exchange and inspiring each other through active storytelling. So if you're doing amazing things, showcase it. Tell people about it, go to conferences and speak about it, put it on your social media, put it on your website, tell as many allies as you can about what you're doing so that you can inspire them to do the same thing. Because that is one of the biggest problems, is that people don't know who is leading the way in this and consequently aren't doing it themselves.
And I absolutely get that, because it can be really hard when you have a very diverse sector where you've got some people who are just starting out and do need that initial, how do we start? But it feels for others that the same conversation, they've had that years ago and they're way past that and they need something else. And I think there is something to be said for clustering organisations and finding like-minded organisations who are kind of like where you are, to then see, well, what could we do next? How are we going to challenge ourselves and push ourselves to do the next thing? Because we're beyond the basics, and we've kind of done that now. And again, it's that how everything, we always say everything needs to be tailored to be meaningful, and it is very difficult to do that. But I think there is something about finding your circle or group of organisations who are in a similar space, and then challenging each other. But then also, telling people about what you've done. But is there a way to kind of mentor those that are a little bit further behind, and to bring them along so that everyone comes up to the level quicker? As we said, there isn't that much time for us to be having the basics conversation, which we're kind of conscious that some of what we've talked about is the starting out stuff, whereas actually it needs to be embedded faster. But those that have done it can bring everyone along faster.
Hi, Natalie from Trigger. We make large-scale outdoor public work that's often attended by tens of thousands of people. And we've got 2 projects where we've created them, and they're down to 2 shipping containers and 20 people on the road. Pollinations is now 8 people on the road, less shipping containers, and now we're working towards creating a concept touring piece of work, which is no people on the road and just a piece of paper, basically, that tells them how to make it in their location. And I was interested to hear from you, Sara, when you were saying how can we do more for less, and I just wondered if you could talk about any new approaches where you're seeing other arts and cultural organisations doing more for less, and any kind of good examples that we can look to.
That's a good one. I feel like I've been in sport for a year, so I haven't been embedded in like climate culture for a while. Well, that bit of culture. Sport is culture. I need to always remember that. Sport is culture. There's no division. What I mean is kind of art and design. I think we had a lot around virtual careering, but it sounds like you've kind of tackled that stuff already, where it was all kind of done online. I think that's the kind of biggest thing I could think of. It was the reducing the number of people that were being schlepped around with the thing, with whatever the artwork is. I don't know if you've come across anything a bit more exciting more recently.
I will be at the event tonight. Come find me.